So I'm here in New York City's Union Square. It's a rainy night here. I know we have a few folks in our class in the Midwest, where I know it's diabolically cold. So I hope your bodies are warm and your hearts are feeling warm. And wherever you are, I hope you had a good week. Going to do a dive tonight as we're still getting going into some teachings on working with emotions and what emotions are from a Buddhist standpoint and from a meditator's standpoint. And this will lead into really the rest of the year, but specifically the rest of this first 8-week course, where we'll really look at some of the core teachings of early Buddhism, or the pieces of the path that are really focused on awareness of ourself as individuals. So I thought we would start with a shamatha session together and really focus a little bit more, as we're going to do tonight, on the quality of awareness, what it means to activate our awareness, and also what it means to have a loving awareness. So I'm going to invite you to take a moment to find your comfortable seat, what direction you want to face, what arrangement you want to be in. We'll be meditating this first session for about 20 minutes. And as you come into your meditation seat, finding this balance of settled but uplifted. And it's always interesting because we come into a relaxed posture. But sometimes when we come into a relaxed posture, we just notice tension. Sometimes the instruction to relax actually highlights the tension or pain or just irritation. So just take a moment to scan your body and see if just awareness can not remove the tension, but soften the tension, make the tension workable. And then we can decide what we want to do with our eye gaze. And just check in with your current state of mind. Just letting what happened before on Tuesday, or whatever day it is, be. And just right now, just notice the flavor of your mind. And the gong ringing can invite us into the formal mindfulness and awareness practice. That can be the signal to slowly begin finding the breath with our attention. But even as the mind begins to connect with a gentle attention to breath, that attention is surrounded by awareness, noticing sounds around you, maybe noticing reactions in your body. Maybe noticing thoughts or feelings that you are resistant to. Or maybe noticing thoughts or feelings that you're really into. And just allowing awareness to allow. So again, we're borrowing this notion from Winnicott of the good enough mother and bringing it into our meditation practice. Maybe to give it a little Shambhala twist, that awareness is here activating as the basically good parent of our mind. So we allow, we notice, if possible, we generate warmth, and all of that is the attitude of awareness. And then every once in a while, there's a discipline moment, a corrective behavior. When the child, which is our mindfulness, our placement of attention, wanders, you just note that, perhaps noting thinking, and bring the child back home to the breath. So please notice if awareness has this quality of warmth for you, or if your awareness is more like a food critic, questioning every little thing that comes up. And we'll just practice together in silence, settling in for about 10 minutes. So as we begin to bring our shamatha meditation to a close, just take a moment to acknowledge that you made it. Even if you're lying in bed for class, which online Buddhist studies allows you to do, even if you didn't make it out of bed, you at least turned on your computer and worked with the practice. So it's always good to acknowledge the effort of practice, just because the actual experience of practice can be so varied, so messy. And if, as the gong rings to bring practice to a close, you'd like to offer yourself and everyone else practicing a bow as an acknowledgement of good effort, please do. Okay, so this is our second Tuesday class. We had our first Saturday class and meeting that Meredith led. We had one more technical glitch and weren't able to record that, but going forward, we believe we have a system in place to record all Tuesdays and Saturdays well. And I wanted to really, in the early part of the class, even though this is a topic that we're going to revisit, probably in depth in each of the courses, second course, third course, definitely the fourth course later in the year when we talk about tantric or Vajrayana teachings. The relationship to emotions is going to be really crucial to have a open-hearted approach to, and also have kind of a good conceptual framework for what the Dharma teachings are around emotions. But I really wanted to get into this just because, well, how to say it, emotions are so important and so misunderstood, and so difficult to work with in meditation. When we get meditation often creates situations where what you thought was, I'm going to feel less, right? I'm going to bring the whole volume of my mind and my body is going to come down, and I'm going to reduce just feeling, and then I'll be better, you know? And a lot of people really do come to meditation this way. And a lot of times what we experience is that mindfulness practice actually brings the volume up on our feelings. Has anyone experienced this in your meditation practice, or is this just me being a triple Cancer, which is my astrological sign, just in case you want to know? I'm a crab through and through. Soft shell crab, right? So if there's any other who share that, you don't have to be a Cancer. Other people feel deep emotions as well, but there is a real sense of like getting closer to our feelings.
Yeah, I agree with you. I co-sign.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
I don't even know who's agreeing, but
this is Daniel from Jamaica.
Oh, welcome.
Yeah. So
Okay.
I'm a water sign too, so I can relate. I'm a Scorpio, so
Okay.
I can
Okay.
relate.
I think non-water signs might also relate, but thank
Yeah,
you so
yes,
much. Yeah.
yes, yes.
I
So I, it's interesting to think about where the first thing I think we need to acknowledge is a very deep bias, and perhaps artists and maybe psychotherapists and maybe others who just have already a good appreciative relationship to emotions. Maybe this isn't your experience. It's always hard to overgeneralize in Buddhist terms, but a very um, deep bias against emotions, especially the ones that are considered negative, so ones like anger or fear or sadness or jealousy, ones that are more painful in their manifestation. And, some of this bias definitely probably comes from good self-reflection. Like a person could reflect on harm that they've caused to themselves or others out of anger, for example. There's one place in the classic Buddhist teachings where it says that a moment of anger has the potential to ruin lifetimes of practice, of good practice, from the Indian master Shantideva. Right. So maybe that's some of our bias against our emotions, is our personal reflections on harm being caused. Or if we came of age in environments where certain emotions, showing emotions, have certain consequences, or the people around us showed emotions in a very reactive and harmful way. In any of these cases, there's going to be a bias against emotions. And then, you look at the different spiritual traditions that influence our world, and there could be a bias against feeling certain emotions. I remember reading the comparative religion expert Karen Armstrong, who wrote a book about the life of the Buddha, which is actually a really good scholarly take on the Buddha's life. It's just called Buddha. Talking about, and I'm paraphrasing poorly here, but basically that the initial idea of every spiritual tradition was to help human beings live more nonviolently and better organized with their emotions, right? Now, we could say some spiritual traditions seem to be much more blockading or confining about the range of emotions that we're actually allowed to feel and feel okay about. Some people think religion is just about shaming people, right? So maybe the bias of different spiritual traditions, East and West, makes us feel like there's certain emotions that are the bad emotions, And I just want to say a lot of this has very clearly influenced the way Buddhist teachings have been translated into the West in the first couple of generations, that there's a sense in some translations of classic Buddhist teachings that emotions are negative experience that practice helps you eliminate. Right? And so sometimes I've seen, and this is a word that's really important to distinguish, that there's a few different words in the Sanskrit language that could mean feelings. One is Vedana, Vedana, which is sometimes translated as sensation, but it's a sense of sensing a reaction to the present moment experience. There's another word that we may come back to when we talk about karma, bhava, B-H-A-V-A, which has a sense of an emergent experience. And then there's a third word, which is very important for students of Buddhism to know, which you may have heard before, which is the word klesha. I'm going to just send this to everyone. I see Joy did a great job with the first two. Thank you, Joy. And klesha is, I capitalized it, Joy, because it's that important to know. the word klesha is the best way I've seen this translated is affliction, right? There's a sense of like some stuck reactivity or stuck habitual pattern around a particular emotion. Right? Some way that the mind has tied itself in a knot and does harmful things around an emotion, right? And this is really when the master Shantideva is talking about anger's power to ruin lifetimes of good work. He's talking about anger as a klesha, as a confused, right? Yeah, Dorian says Pema Chodron talks about the idea of a hook, which is related to this concept. When Shantideva says anger has the power to ruin lifetimes, he's talking about anger as a klesha, a stuck reactivity. Now, it's also the case, as we'll investigate, especially when we get to the tantric approach to emotions, that emotions have a lot of wisdom, right? You could easily say anger is responsible for social movements. You know, anger is responsible for social justice movements. You know, feminism is a result of anger, right? So maybe other emotions as well. You know, movements against animal rights activists are angry a lot of the time, right? Any activist is angry a lot of the time. And so there could be a wisdom to our emotions as well. As we're going to see, as we start the path, and this gets us into the next few weeks of our discussion, right now we're really interested in what causes suffering, which we'll talk more about next week. But it's really important to start this discussion with an acknowledgement that if we are going to practice mindfulness and awareness, we have to do that with, you could say, as much of an unbiased approach as possible, but better probably to say it with as much awareness of our biases as possible. And this is one thing I find that people who come to meditation and come to Buddhist studies because we're trying to be good people, we often really import lots of biases against emotions, especially the more painful and disruptive ones. Right? A Buddhist should never experience jealousy. Has anybody ever had that thought? Or should stop feeling jealous? That's such a biased approach. That's such an unmindful approach to jealousy, because we haven't really even looked at it yet and said, what is it? You know, what is this feeling? And if we want our practice to be scientific, you know, we start with a hypothesis, and the hypothesis here is maybe I don't have a completely mature and awake relationship to my own emotions, which is part of suffering. But the scientific investigation is let's see what emotions really are. Right? So I just invite you to take a moment, you know, and maybe you can also do this throughout the week ahead, to just contemplate or notice if any of this notion of bias towards or against emotions resonates with you, because it could work the other way, that you're biased towards certain emotions, right? Love is a great thing. I mean, that's true, but is that coming from experience, or is that coming from that's what you're supposed to feel because that's what a good mindful person feels? Maybe love is painful. Maybe love is confusing. So let's just take a moment to think about if we resonate with this notion of maybe I have some biases against or towards my emotions, and just see that we're coming with that. Okay. So most of what I want to talk about is to go a little bit deeper as a basic functionality of meditation practice into the meaning of awareness in relationship to mindfulness. Again, these words are often used synonymously, and in a cognitive sense, actually, they have a distinct function in meditative teachings. And the other thing I want to talk about is looking at rain as a framework for how we could begin to practice with emotions in a more direct, but also in a more non-biased way, in a more friendly way.
Sorry, I have a question. I didn't hear the key word there. It blanked out.
It did blank out. Okay. Was that, did you miss the word?
Just
rain?
now you want to look at blank as a...
Rain.
Rain?
R-A-I-N.
Okay, that's, okay.
Yes. So rain is, I'm going to get into what rain is. It's an, what's the word? Acronym? Is that the word? For a methodology, a meditative methodology for investigating emotions that was primarily developed by Tara Brach. Tara Brach is a very well-known insight meditation teacher, and also well-known psychotherapist. Has several really good books. Radical Acceptance is one of them, but also provided a link, which I hope some folks saw, for those of you who are interested, to her leading about a 12-minute session of contemplation of this RAIN method, right? So it's R-A-I-N. And I want to link that with a deeper understanding of what we mean by awareness. Okay, so I want to take a little moment to geek out and talk about mindfulness and awareness, right? So does anybody know, and you can just type this if you do know, does anybody know the Pali word for mindfulness? Or the Sanskrit word? Great. Doug just brought it. Yes. So sati, S-A-T-I, is the Pali word for mindfulness. And this gets smrti, S-M-R-T-I, is the Sanskrit word. It's one of these I'd like to buy a vowel Sanskrit words. And Trenpa is the Tibetan word. So if you see any of these words, these are the words in Buddhism that are most often translated as mindfulness. And there's different definitions, but mindfulness has a sense of placing one's attention in a certain frame of reference. So mindfulness of breath means that the mind is honing in of all the things you could place your attention on the feeling, the sensory, the tactile sensation of the body breathing. You could also hone in, for those of you who are geeking out a little bit and studying the 4 types of mindfulness that the Buddha taught, you could hone in on sensations, feelings. You could hone in on thoughts, right? You could hone in on a particular contemplation, like reading a particular line of a text and contemplating it. So there's all kinds of ways to place the mind in a frame of reference and work with holding it there for a moment. Right? Mindful walking could be another example of placing your mind on the act of walking as you're walking. And holding it there, and then it wanders, and then you come back to placing your mind in that particular activity or that particular frame of reference. So there's a kind of conscious act in mindfulness, and then with awareness, as we mentioned last week, so the word in Pali for awareness is this long word that I'm typing in. And don't worry if this is way too much information, but it's samprajanya. And in Tibetan, it's sheshin, a sense of presently knowing. Right? So I don't know if you heard as I was guiding meditation and asking you all to connect with your breath, but here in Union Square, there was a siren moment. Sounded like there were multiple sirens heading to hopefully a false alarm. I hope everybody is safe wherever those sirens were going. But I wasn't asking you to listen to sound. So if you did hear that coming through my microphone, that would be because your awareness was in a sense of a contextual knowing, and just sort of something came into it, right? And it was held in awareness for a moment. It's just like as you're breathing, you might notice what your nose feels like right now, right? Or you might notice an emotion that you didn't notice earlier in the day. Say, oh wow, I've been feeling a little bit down today, and I'm just noticing that. You know, I didn't ask you to pay attention to how you are feeling emotionally right now. It just comes up in awareness, right? So there's a knowing context around the frame of reference of mindfulness. And this is what we mean by awareness. And I will also claim, especially when it comes to working with emotions, that the development of awareness, and I'm going to say something a little bit cognitively controversial from a Buddhist standpoint, and other folks might disagree with this. I'm going to say that the development of awareness is more important than the development of mindfulness. They work together, so what I said is a little bit nonsensical, but oftentimes we are focusing so much on, can I concentrate, right? Can I hold my mind to the breath? And we have less emphasis on, am I meeting my experience in an awake way? Am I noticing what happens? There's a famous talk where Pema Chodron talks about, I think I may have mentioned this, the students coming in for an interview, and in terms of how their meditation practice is going, and they're really analyzing everything they're doing wrong. And Pema says, I just want to know if the student knows what is happening to them when they practice. Right? This sense of knowing, and also what is the quality of the knower, right? What is the quality of the knower? Is your knower, does it function? And I do realize in using this example of a basically good parent for awareness, that could be, to use an overused word, triggering for some of us, based on what our own experience there is. So it could, another word that might be helpful is the quality of awareness is just a good friend. Sometimes our awareness feels like a film critic, right? Sometimes our awareness might feel like a sheriff or a aggressive police officer? And so RAIN, this way of looking at emotions, I think is so beautiful, not just because it actually helps us bring emotions into our practice as an object of investigation, but it also, I think, highlights the qualities of what we're trying to bring out in our awareness as we meditate, right? So I think everyone is pretty aware of the first quality, the R quality of RAIN being related to awareness, which is the ability to recognize. Like, oh, that's a siren. Oh, that's a discursive thought. That's a term that's often used a lot in meditation as well, as the term discursive thought. So what discursive thought means, I love the way my dad, who's going to be guest lecturing for us in April, likes to put it, is a discursive thought has a quality of the mind just sort of anxiously entertaining itself. The way my dad puts it related to discursive thought is he says, you can imagine him doing a little bit of almost stand-up, says, so when I'm thinking, it's sort of like I'm trying to tell myself something. But don't I already know what I'm going to say? And that's the quality of discursive thought, is that there's a kind of chatter going on. You know, it's like you're making your to-do list constantly. You're going over what you already decided. There's a sense of the mind sort of hiccuping and second-guessing itself constantly. So awareness recognizes how often the nourishment that our brain gets is actually just chewed up by periods of discursive thought. Sometimes very anxiously, sometimes very just as an entertainment mechanism, you know. And so recognition is this ability to see what's happening. And also maybe to name it, you know. This is such an amazing aspect of our awareness's ability, is just the ability to recognize a pattern. Oh yes, this is that thing again, right? That's a siren. That's a discursive thought. That's anger, right? Now, am I saying discursive thoughts are a bad thing? No, I'm not saying that they're a bad thing. Again, that would be a kind of bias. We're investigating what our mind does and what arises in our mind. So this sort of cognitive perceptual element, I think, is what we relate to awareness in general, is this quality of recognition. Something arises in our experience and we say, oh, this is that. This is that. And sometimes we don't know what it is, right? That's, I think, the other thing about being kind to ourselves, especially when it comes to mindfulness of emotions, is a lot of us might actually be fairly unfamiliar with our emotions. We're not really trained too much in emotion recognition on the spot. And what I mean by that is sort of like the wave of feeling that happens in the body, right? We might be trained to analyze the emotion. We might be trained to judge the emotion. We might be trained to look into the causes of an emotion, but just that sense of the ability to know what's happening in the present moment as it's happening is actually quite advanced. And it's okay if in most of our life we recognize emotions after the fact, you know. Does anyone ever get yourself into trouble because a couple hours, let's say, after you got angry, somebody comes up to you and says, so you got angry there, right? And you say, no, I didn't. Right? That, for me, those moments are an opportunity, maybe a humble opportunity to practice the recognition after the fact. That's the other thing I want to say about emotions, is it's considered very advanced to be able to do something like rain on the spot. Right. That's why both in Tara Brach's approach and in Sharon Salzberg's approach in Real Happiness with Emotions, the meditative discipline is to reflect on something that's been coming up for you recently, and to reflect on it in a situation where you're in a safe, silent meditation, where it's after the fact and you feel like a little bit settled in your body. That's a much more accessible way to investigate emotions some of the time. Right? But so that's beautiful, just to be able to recognize this is happening, you know. And I would love to share with you that I think it really took me at least 10 years into my meditation practice before I actually before I actually came out of this Buddhist bias towards or against certain positive or negative mind states, and was just able to apply really, I mean, I could be pretty mindful of my breath. Sometimes I could go into states of meditative absorption, and even in my early 20s around my breath. But it took a long time before I could step out of this Buddhist bias and just be like, oh, this is jealousy. This is desire. This is sadness, you know? So if I could save anyone some time, I mean, if you've already had a 10-year meditation career, that's fine. But if there's anything I can do to save you some time and just say it's actually better and more awake to just say, oh, this is what that is, I would like to save you all that time. So recognition and the ability to recognize what something is without instantly making it a problem. That's a huge component of our present knowing, or samprajanya, or sheshin. The A, there's different interpretations of the A. I've heard the word accept, which I think accept is a complicated term in Buddhist thought. I like what Tara Brach says in her meditation, to allow, right? Allow it to be there. So noticing if there's a tendency, and there are generally two tendencies with states of mind. What are the two? To either want to push it away because it's painful or because it's viewed as negative. Or what's the other one? To grab it, right? To grab an object or grab the experience, you know? So we all have emotions that we really want to grab, you know? I can say as a writer that a lot of times we writers and poets and maybe other forms of artists, when we feel sadness, oh yeah, you really want to grab the sadness, you know? And allow is about holding this space of awareness where you are neither grasping nor rejecting. You're just letting it inhabit the space of awareness. So the quality that I think of in relationship to awareness that we're bringing out with allowing is to really start to gain trust. And this is really the beauty of our minds, that awareness is actually bigger than any mental arising. In other words, a lot of times we are afraid, and if we have certain negative or even traumatic relationships with certain emotions, this fear is very valid, but we're afraid that the arising is going to flood our awareness. It's going to just take over the whole thing. And allowing is this moment of saying, like, actually my awareness is like this huge sphere, and this moment, there's plenty of space for it, even if it's painful, even if it's uncomfortable. The third one is investigate. And this is where the way I think about this is where mindfulness kind of joins up with awareness. And you actually look deeper into the emotion, right? So here's what I'll offer. A lot of us are trained in doing an analytic investigation of our emotions. In other words, like, what's causing this emotion? What was the environment of my education that caused me to have this relationship to this emotion? You know, how did my parents screw me up? Even if you had Buddhist parents like I did, you can still feel like your parents screwed you up a little bit. Love them both. You can analyze the emotion, right, as sort of like a more conceptual, like, what are the causes that bring about this emotion? But because we have such a tendency to do that, most of the meditative techniques that I've really connected with, Tara Brach's, the way emotions are often explored in the Shambhala tradition and others, focus on dropping the conceptual analysis for a moment and investigating the emotion in the body. In other words, investigating where, once you've named the emotion, which is recognition, and allowed it to be there for a while, to see if there is a sensation, a vedana, a feeling in the body that is associated with this emotion. And I find this is really interesting research into how our mind-body connection works. I'm not saying that we can't do the conceptual analysis. That's actually part of Buddhist thought too, to actually investigate the causes and conditions. That's often called contemplative meditation, and it can be really helpful. But because we are so in our heads a lot of the time about our emotional experience, to just drop that and bring the mind into the body and investigate. And chances are that you will find a bodily sensation that feels a little bit uncomfortable, right? Even if the emotion, this is the interesting thing, even if the emotion is considered a positive one, you know, like sometimes I really do know this experience, like sometimes hanging out with my daughter, who, you know, she makes a mess sometimes, but she's just like an awesome kid. And sometimes when I actually just feel my feelings for my daughter, it actually hurts, which from a conceptual framework is really, doesn't make any sense, right? Why would love hurt in the body? Why would there be a disturbance within the body that actually feels like an uncomfortable physical experience around a positive emotion? But that is the case, right? And we have all kinds of tactics for avoiding painful sensations. And one of those tactics is to get caught up in a narrative in the mind that takes us away from the bodily sensation. So just exploring the bodily sensations associated with the arising of an emotion, even if they're subtle, even if it doesn't quite add up, or you think you might be projecting a sensation into your body, investigating that way can be a really simple and direct and beautiful practice. It is often the case that our reactivity to our emotions in real life, in my humble experience, is because an emotion arises, there's a sensation, and then there's a feeling like I need to do something to get rid of this sensation. And that's where reactivity comes in. I love, I forgot to write down his name. Rick Hanson. Rick Hanson, in his book, he's the one who wrote Buddha's Brain. He's another evolutionary biologist and psychologist, similar to Robert Wright, who wrote Why Buddhism is True. In one of his books, he talks about the difference between being responsive and being reactive. And reactivity, you could say, is the klesha response. It's when the pain of the emotion comes up, the habitual reaction is so immediate that just to get rid of the discomfort of the emotion, we do the reaction. Write something sarcastic on Twitter because it's so painful. The tweet that I just read is so painful. I cannot believe somebody would write that, would think that in the year 2019. So the way that I'm going to divest myself of this pain is just come up with a snarky response, and that'll make me feel better. And here we're saying, can I take a moment to investigate the bodily sensations and then perhaps do a more conceptual investigation first? But to just keep it simple and clear, I think starting with investigation with this I as an investigation of our somatic experience of emotion is really helpful. And then last but not least, we have the N. And there are two distinct approaches to N. I don't know if anybody's noticed. Does anybody remember, if you did check out the Tara Brach guided meditation, does anybody remember what the N was? If you want to just write it or say it. Right. Nurture is the word that she uses, very close to nourish. I don't think those are quite synonymous, nurture and nourish, right? So she talks about nurture, right, which is this quality of warmth, this quality of caring for the feeling. So this is where, as we move forward in our second course, we're going to focus a lot on loving kindness, meditation, and the 4 immeasurables practice. So this is where some sense of actually wishing something towards our experience could be helpful. But it could also just be that we're working with this quality of awareness that's holding the moment in kindness, The other approach, yes, Doug got it right, which is a little bit more difficult conceptually. And I wonder if this is why, I don't know, but I wonder if this is why Tara Brach went to nurture, because the other approach is confusing. The other N is non-identification. This gets us more into an approach to emotions that's a little bit more about Buddhist teachings on non-self or emptiness. This is also related to the reading, if anybody had a chance to check it out, Chogyam Trungpa from Myth of Freedom about the dualistic barrier, right? This quality that we often look at our mental experiences as something over here, right? The awareness is observing them, but it's like, that's me over there, right? That's my anger. That's my desire. These are my beliefs. And it almost creates a separation, a duality between awareness, our knowing mind, and our experience of ourself. It's like there's a split going on. Right? And I talked about this in The Road Home, that as soon as there's this quality of split, and it's like, that's me over there, then we have to actually defend our experience, right? It becomes something substantial and something separate from our own awareness that has to be defended as an object. And this is another way of looking at where reactivity comes in. So there's another approach to the N, which is that there's just a sense of seeing, and there's different methods for working with this, seeing the experience as not unimportant, because that wouldn't be necessarily very nurturing, and seeing the experience of the emotion not necessarily as not something to care for, but seeing it as not solid, not permanent, not a brick. You know, we often look at our emotions as sort of like bricks, and they're more liquid than that. Literally, it means that something is moving through us. So the non-identification has a sense of using Buddhist ideas of what's sometimes called ultimate truth. And we'll get more into this when we get into the teachings on ego and the 5 skandhas and non-self. But using ultimate truth to sort of soften the separation from and the solidification of the self that happens. Right? So here's the thing. And we'll do this at the end of our class. I want to leave some time for discussion. I think you can take either approach to the N. I think sometimes if we take the ultimate approach without just a little bit of relative nurturing and care and loving kindness towards ourselves, it can get a little conceptual. But this gets at the quality, these two definitions of the N in RAIN, nurture and non-identify, they get at a conversation that we're going to return to in different formats, relative and ultimate truth in Buddhism, how that works. And they also get at these two qualities of awareness, of the basically good space of knowing that we're trying to bring out more and more through our practice and path. And the two qualities that I really want to leave this lecture with before we get into more discussion are warmth, that an awakened awareness is a warm space. It's actually very nurturing of the arising, right? It's like, oh, anger. Hi, anger. Which that is so advanced, what I just said. And I would be lying if I say I can inhabit that space perfectly or even well when I experience anger, right? But there's some quality of actual curiosity and care towards our experience and towards whatever arises in the mind, you know, whatever crazy thought or emotion arises in your mind. There's just like, oh, hi, that's interesting. How are you? And then there's another aspect, which is non-attachment, right? So warmth and non-attachment. It's letting, awareness is letting things arise, dwell, and transform into something else. And this is, if you're really paying attention, this is what emotions do, right? Our problem is that we've gotten into certain stuck places where the emotional energy gets stuck, and then we feel like we have to either defend, attack, or ignore something, as we talked about with the 3 poisons. And so these are the qualities when I'm thinking about what Mark Epstein and others have done to really look at the good enough mother as a quality of awareness. Looking at awareness as the basically good parent, these are the qualities: warmth and non-attachment. If an emotion wants to hang out with you for a while, that's great. But there's a sense of not grasping and not rejecting. So I'd like to open it up to some discussion. We can also bring in some of the work of Robert Wright in Why Buddhism is True, where he really looks at this modular theory of how the mind works, that different sort of modes of relating to experience are activated by different emotional triggers or prompts, and how that sort of helps us develop a more awareness of our emotional palette. But I think I've been talking for a while, and you should be able to unmute yourself. So I'll be looking for discussion that way. And also, if you want to put something in the chat box, you can do it that way. So I'm already seeing one question from Hunt, the working definition of awareness, right? So the easiest one of the 3 languages that I gave is to use the Tibetan word she shin, so SHESHIN. She is this quality of knowing, and shin means sort of like presently knowing. Presently knowing. So in a sense, awareness is always that sense that's seeing the context around whatever mindfulness is framing up for us in this moment. Right. So it's kind of knowing the environment around mindfulness's placement. So that's probably the best. It's a sort of a natural, and we don't, that's the other key thing to remind ourselves from last week about awareness. We don't do anything to activate awareness. It arises. But what we can do is either, that's problematic, is we either fixate on or reject what awareness brings into our attention. So I see from Dusty, there's a question about the gap, which, if it's okay, I want to really work with the gap when we get to the teachings on karma and the 12 steps in a karmic cycle a little later in this course. But the gap is super crucial. One way to work with the gap functionally is one of the best Dharma teachings I've ever heard from Pema Chodron when she's talking about this notion of how we get stuck in emotional reactivity, not in a meditation session, but in life. Best teaching ever is just take 3 breaths, literally create a gap or a space in time where we can connect with our body breathing before responding, right? So that's a very functional example of the gap. So I love this question from Stephen. Why should we practice? Why should awareness be not attached to positive emotions, right? The other way of looking at attachment is control, right? This is I feel like actually this might be a better word in English. The word attachment and non-attachment can be a very confusing term in Buddhist thought, especially when compared to like a Western psychological tradition like attachment theory, you know, where a secure attachment is a really good thing to have. Within the Buddhist definition of attachment, there's more of a sense of fixation, right? So, and there is a way to fixate on love or fixate on kindness, right? Or fixate on those moments where we feel warmth towards humanity or warmth towards ourselves, right? And this fixation can turn really quickly, I think, into a desire to try to, or a need to try to control the outcome, right? So, for example, to use my experience of loving my daughter, right? What happens if there's a moment where the quality of love, that warmth that I feel towards her, doesn't, just because of the way life is and the way mind is, it doesn't feel the same? What if I experience boredom towards my daughter? You know, what if a thought arises that is like, oh, you again? Really? We're doing this again? You know, if there's a sense of fixating on a certain definition of what the feeling of love has to feel like, or what any other positive emotion has to feel like, then what the mind would do when we can't control that outcome, when suddenly I feel bored by my daughter, is it will start to judge itself, right? It'll start to say, oh my God, am I being a bad parent? Or maybe, probably not in that case, there would probably be a real psychological problem if I did feel this, but maybe starting to judge the other person, right? And so the non-attachment to positive emotions is realizing that we cannot control what arises in the mind. This is one of the most brilliant insights from Robert Wright's book. It's coming in the section after he's talking about the modular theory of the mind. And this really relates to awareness as well, is the insight in his conversation with Joseph Goldstein that conscious mind is not the generator of our mental experience, it is the recipient of our mental experience. Right? So in other words, the feeling of love as it comes into awareness is something that I'm receiving. It's not necessarily something that I'm doing or producing. Now, there are techniques which we'll work with to try to generate more positive feelings towards ourselves and others, right? So we will work with those techniques, but we can't fixate on those techniques, and we can't fixate on outcome, because the moment we were feeling love towards a cute toddler and now we feel bored of her, we feel like I did that. I made myself bored and now I'm an awful person. So that's why we're talking about non-attachment. It's because conscious mind cannot control what arises in it. It can maybe influence it, but it can't control the arising, dwelling, and ceasing of different emotional patterns or thoughts. And the attempt to control it, you could say, is what creates the kleshas to begin with. Yeah. Seeing from Maud, fascinated by Robert Wright's description of the modular theory of the mind. And it is really fascinating, you know, and I just got to have lunch with had lunch with Daniel Goleman, who's another contemporary thinker in the link between Western psychology, neuroscientist, and Buddhist thought. He co-authored a great book on the positive effects of meditation, altered traits, which came out last year or the year before. And he talks a lot about the default mode network, which is one of the modes in the modular theory of the mind. And basically the default mode network is what, my understanding at least, and if somebody has a better understanding, please feel free to jump in. But the default mode network is basically what the mind, it's the network that's activated in our circuitry when we're not engaged in any particular task, you know? So in a sense, you could say that this is the mode that we're trying to shift our relationship to, especially in shamatha meditation practice, because from a certain standpoint, all we're doing is following the breath and coming back to the breath and not getting any credit for doing so. So the notion of actually giving ourselves a little task is how this works, and also noticing how often we move into the default mode network, how much of our life that actually dominates. So I was fascinated by this modular theory of the mind. It's interesting because, like anything else, it's just a theory that then is tried in experience, you know, and Western and Eastern practice has subjective experience, and Western practice has mostly like studying what parts of the brain and nervous system are lighting up when certain things are happening. But I was especially fascinated by Robert Wright's depiction that what shifts us into a new mode is usually an emotional response. So becoming aware of an emotional response and realizing that we are literally shifting into a different network circuitry, which isn't really under our control, right? Somebody says something mean to us, or something potentially threatening to our identity, or even threatening to our body, or somebody says something romantic to us. Literally, there's an emotion that arises, and then a different part of our neural circuitry lights up. That's my understanding. And so this ability to be friendly with our emotions and awareness, to bring this warmth and non-attachment to them, seems super crucial, you know, and that ability to stop trying to control what we think and feel, because the scientists are literally discovering that we can't control in the present moment what we think and feel. What we can do is influence our long-term attitude through practices like mindfulness, loving kindness, compassion, etc. But to actually give ourselves that break in terms of working with thoughts and especially emotions feels so important. So important. So yeah, I got a lot out of the modular mode theory of the mind, and how related it is to the feeling of the emotional prompt. So there's a question from Kevin about What's the difference between emotion and judgment? Yeah, it's an interesting question. Guilt feeling like an emotion. I think in some ways guilt is an emotion. I don't know if we want to distinguish guilt from shame. I think these, for a lot of us, especially if you grew up with any circumstances that made you think it wasn't okay to feel certain feelings, then guilt and shame towards those feelings is probably going to be a big part of our awareness process. Pema Chodron does a great job, I think, distinguishing guilt from what she calls positive remorse, right? So that's my way of thinking about this. If the emotion as a mental physical experience is just sort of the raw material, and then the klesha is a habituated, confused reaction, then I would think of remorse as the emotion and guilt as the klesha, if that makes sense. I once had a conversation with one of my teachers, mentors, who's a Tibetan Lama based in Seattle, Dzogchen Ponlop Rinpoche, because he wrote a book called Emotional Rescue, and he invited me to sort of host and interview him for the New York release of his book. And so we talked a little bit about, it seems like shame has a certain negative quality, problematic quality from a dharmic standpoint, or guilt, which it kind of puts up a blockage between us and mindfulness, right? You don't even want to do the rain process or any other process with the emotions because you don't even want to admit you were feeling jealous, you know? I keep coming back to jealousy because I'm in New York City, and as I get to travel to other cities, you know, maybe there's a little bit, it could be that different places on earth have different primary emotions. I don't know if you've ever thought of that. New York runs on jealousy because it's a bunch of people who are trying to succeed at something, speeding around with a bunch of other people who are trying to succeed at something. And even the people who have succeeded don't think they've succeeded enough. But it is so shameful for a New Yorker to admit that they're experiencing envy or jealousy. I find that myself, and I find that in other people, that's sort of our most shameful emotion. And so I think shame blocks us from even recognizing the emotion. But if I look at the qualities of remorse, like, oh man, I told that joke in class, and I don't think it landed well, or it might have hurt somebody's feelings. There's a certain quality, if I feel that in my body, the remorse, there's a certain quality where it is just a raw emotion, right? And there's no judgment. It's just, wow, I feel bad that I did that. I may have caused harm. I may have spread confusion. So I do like Pema's distinction between positive remorse and guilt or shame as this way of distinguishing the pure emotion, which may have some wisdom to it, from the habituated or stuck response. Yeah. Hunt says that New York runs on jealousy and caffeine. That's true, but if you go to the Pacific Northwest, I find that Portland and Seattle run even more on caffeine, at least. Yeah. Yeah. So Joshua is talking about two Pali words, which I haven't heard, or I don't remember hearing. Hiri and Otapa, referred to as shame and guilt. And an interesting thing around this, and this might be me geeking out a little bit, but that's part of what I do. So there's one teaching which categorizes in classic Buddhist psychology uh, uh, different different mind states with which we experience, and there's in this teaching there's certain positive emotions, and here, and actually in this definition, a positive emotion is an emotion that helps us remember mindfulness, right? So that's the definition, helps us remember why we would want to be present. And a negative emotion is, or a negative afflicted emotion, it has a list of those. And in this teaching of 51 different mind states or categories of mind, which are called in Sanskrit samskara, which we'll get back to when we talk about the constituent elements of the confused self. So anyway, in this teaching, there's 26 negative mind states and 11 positive mind states. And in this teaching, it's really interesting. It's a very different approach. Shame and embarrassment both come up as positive mind states. And I've never been able to figure out if this is more of an Asian cultural approach or that the translations of shame and embarrassment, because I'm not a direct translator, were just not the right ways to translate these into modern English. But the definition is of shame is that because you're holding yourself to a higher standard to be an awake person, when you do something that degrades yourself or furthers your confusion, you feel shame because you know that you can do better than that. And embarrassment is because you care what other people you respect think about you. You avoid harmful behavior because you are concerned about the your reputation among other compassionate and awake beings. And so I was thinking about this because these could totally be kleshas, right? This constant self-judgment of, I screwed up again, I suck, etc. Or this constant like wondering what other people think about you, you know. These could totally be confused kleshas. But I was thinking about this, that this is coming from a body of teachings that thinks that the nature of being a human being is fundamentally awake, right? The notion is that our innermost selves here, our Buddha nature, is so positive and so realized that when we degrade that, it's not like I suck. It's like I need to get back to being my wisdom self. And that's the quality in which shame or embarrassment could be considered in classic Buddhist thought positive qualities. But it took me a while to figure out, like, why on this list of samskaras are shame and embarrassment considered like positive qualities for the path. And I think the more we respect ourselves and the more we actually believe in our own basic goodness and Buddha nature, awakened nature, it is quite possible that embarrassment and shame become like, that our approach to them becomes different. I could totally see that, but it's probably not the way that most people I'm talking to, nor myself, experience shame and embarrassment. More, it's this blockade against even recognizing that we're having an emotional response, so that the awareness can't ever come in, you know. And there's something very humbling about recognizing that we are experiencing an emotion, and it's possible that you could be, in my case, 40 years old. It's possible that you could have been meditating for 25 years. It's possible that you're older than I am. It's possible that you, in your, what you do for a living, you help other people deal with their emotions. And you could say like, wow, I've never really developed full mindfulness of this emotion. And it's humbling. You know, mindfulness of emotions is humbling, and it would be a lot easier a lot of the time to just bypass this and go to like, can we have these deep conversations about karma and emptiness, etc. But there's something so beautiful about taking a more loving approach to our emotions and just being like, so I hope everybody, that's my hope for this week, is that we actually spot negative emotions arising in us. The things that a spiritual person might say, like, oh, I'm not supposed to be feeling that, or at least I'm not supposed to admit that I'm feeling that. Or here's the real one. Thich Nhat Hanh definitely doesn't feel that one anymore, right? The emotions that the Dalai Lama definitely doesn't feel, or, you know, our favorite spiritual people definitely don't feel. And you notice yourself feeling that. And I hope we feel it fully and can actually bring a little bit of this loving awareness to it. So time for one or two more questions or comments. And again, everybody's using the chat board, which is really wonderful. If anybody wants to turn on your mic and hear your voice in this space, we can do that as well. I see one quick question from Zed about the 7-day meditation vow. We do have the 7-day meditation vow, which is something we used to work as an optional practice from the Interdependence Project. And I thought I would introduce that as an option to close out our classes in the 3rd week of class. So if that's okay, we will have a moment to contemplate how many practice sessions we want to commit to in this week at the end of our practice after we do a little rain. But we'll talk about the 7-day meditation vow as a optional support for practice next week. Should we just do some rain? Make it rain? You can't make it rain. You can just practice rain. So if you want to take a momentary stretch or refresh or a sip of water, whatever you need to do to just come to your practice with a moment of fresh mind, it's always good before a practice session or sometimes in the middle of a practice session to take a fresh start. Do that with mindfulness. Just do whatever you need to do to come back to now, feeling nurtured, feeling good. And this will be a slightly shorter session, about 15 minutes or a little bit less. So when we hear the gong ring, we can just for a few minutes come into our bodies, maybe find our seat, find our body breathing again as a way to set the stage for this rain investigation of emotions. So again, a lot of times rain works well as a reflection. We could try to practice this on the spot as an emotion is arising, but that's really hard because life is moving so fast. The stimuli of emotions sometimes is sudden, sometimes surprising. So, but let's take a moment to reflect on a recent energetic experience, a place where you felt stuck a little bit or reactive, and a particular emotion that we felt stuck with. And you can start to bring to mind, as a way to reflect, perhaps the environment or even a relationship where this emotion gets more tense or more present for you. So you can close your eyes and visualize yourself in the space where this emotion, perhaps klesha, has been arising. And recognize what this emotion is. Language is imperfect, so it may not feel like a particular label or a word well describes it, but just see what word comes up to practice recognition. Another aspect of recognition is the clear seeing. So Mingyur Rinpoche, when he was talking about his experience of anxiety and even panic, used the image that if you can see the river, it means you're not caught in the rushing river. So if you can name the emotion, there's a sense of clarity and non-stuckness just in saying this is blank. And then see if you can allow that to be part of your mind-body experience. Allow yourself to feel it. Allow it to do what it needs to do. And then let's investigate. So again, investigating here means to let the narrative around the emotion be for a moment and bring your attention fully into the body. Is there a place in the body, subtle or not subtle sensation, or any other kind of physical experience that feels connected to this emotion for you? And just see if you can really bring the attention fully there to that sensation, that region, and just investigate. And finally, the N. So perhaps there's a wish or even an expression from the loving kindness frame that you'd like to make towards yourself related to this emotion. May I, or may this. Notice if your wish is, may this go away completely. And that's okay to notice yourself wanting that. And then to work with N in the other way, in this sense of removing the dualistic barrier. I'm going to ask you to bring your awareness as fully as you can into your body where you feel this emotion, so that it's not your eyes or your brain looking down at the sensation, but it's like your mind was just fully and lovingly inhabiting your body where you feel the emotion. And then see if your emotion can open out. Your awareness can open out, to a much larger space. So you might want to raise your gaze and just still feel your body, but feel the space of the room that you're in. That there's a sense of vastness. A sense of coming and going in your awareness. Feelings come, we nurture them, and then they just dissolve into the vast space of awareness. So letting go of needing to hold on to anything related to this emotion. And then you can find your breath for one final minute. Feel that. If there was a particularly intense experience for you in this practice, you may want to emphasize the out breath, even sigh as you breathe out a few times, just to let everything be. So thank you all for practicing rain together. So a few things I'll say in closing, and we'll call it an evening. In terms of the N part of rain, if you want to do this practice again, the nurturing aspect could be to make a particular wish or to ask what this emotion needs. To feel fully seen, I guess you could say, fully felt, fully acknowledged. And the aspect of N that I focused on in this meditation has more to do with a perceptual way that we could practice non-identifying, which is in the document from me on emotions, which is to join fully with the experience in the body of the emotion, join the mind as completely inhabited, and then to open the awareness out to space from there. So you're removing that sense of separation from your body, separation from the emotion, but then there's a vaster space of awareness in which this emotion is just a moment arising. If you want to do this practice on your own, please do. My advice is don't choose the most difficult emotion. You can learn so much from just your smaller emotions, like little annoyances, little frustrations, little desires. So you don't have to go to your most difficult place. I call that being a kamikaze meditator. You can take the spiciness of the whole thing down a little bit. And doing this practice with just like small moments of irritation throughout the day can be really helpful. And you can do it on the spot, but it's a little harder to remember the whole sequence on the spot. And if you do succeed in doing it on the spot, that's a pretty big experience of awareness to begin with. So we'll have a class on Saturday again. Just a reminder that the faculty is rotating on Saturday, so it's whoever your faculty point person for your quads is not necessarily who's teaching on Saturday. We're going to get a chance to experience all of the different teachers, and seems like we had a few less technical glitches tonight, so that feels really good. I would just encourage, as we head into our third week, to just take a moment to think about how frequently you want to practice this week as an aspiration. And again, thinking about being reasonable. If it's 4 times, 2 times, if you're clear that you want to commit to a daily practice at this point, and just in your head make that commitment, that's wonderful too. And next week we're going to go take a dive into some of the classic Buddhist teachings that are more frameworks and lists, and we're going to spend 2 weeks on the Four Noble Truths, decoding that. And I think that's going to be a really juicy experience. So anything that if any of the other faculty members are on, and if there's anything that I missed, please let me know. But we have a lot of frameworks now, the email blast, the Facebook group, which we may be revisiting these various frameworks as we go. Our quads and our faculty point person to also bring up questions or comments throughout the week. But if there's anything that I missed, either from the faculty or anyone else, I'll just say going once and going twice. Oh yes, one thing from Adriana is it might be set up that your email browser is set up to send emails from Mailchimp into spam or promotions. So you want to look because we are going to be sending out emails to the whole group via the Mailchimp service. So it may be going to your spam or your promotions box. So just if you can't find something, look for it there. And I think that's it for tonight. So maybe we can just take a moment if you'd like to. I love the practice of beginning and ending with a bow as a way to acknowledge ourselves and acknowledge each other. So if you'd like to join me in that, either we can do the bow in Anjali, which is more classic Buddhist bow. Those of you connected with the Shambhala tradition, there's the warrior's bow, heart open and hands on the thighs, just slightly below the hips. So whatever way of acknowledging yourself and each other is useful to you, including not bowing, we'll do that now. Have a great evening, everyone, and have a great week. And those of you who are in places that are cold, please stay warm. It's really cold where it's cold. Okay, take care. Bye-bye.